Let me have my protocols. Specialist, clarify that. Colonel Steck said it, without looking at me. He moved his hand in my direction, the way you move a hand toward a whiteboard. A small, efficient gesture, toward a piece of equipment. The two-star general across the table waited. I stood up. I walked to the front of the room. I explained the branching logic of the 47-page protocol I had spent 6 years building, and General Claremont nodded and said, "Good thinking," and looked at Steck when he said it. The brief between them had Steck's name on the cover. I did not correct this. I went back to my chair. When the meeting ended, I heard Steck's voice behind me. Easy and warm, directed at Claremont, fortunate to have good technical support on my team. I kept walking. I did not turn around. I'm Dana Reyes, 38 years old. That was April of 2021. It was only the second time. There is a window of 90 seconds. That is the number Colonel Steck was too confident to ask me about. That is the number I had been building against for 11 years. The wall between a decision and a consequence. The wall that decides who goes home. And the morning that number was finally needed. The morning 23 lives depended on someone running the framework correctly. The doctor who had been trained by me, and only by me. Stopped everything in front of observers from 4 nations, looked around the room and said, "Where is Major Reyes?" I was 40 feet away. I was sitting in the back corner, in a folding chair, under a sign that read, Medical Support Coordination. The last thing I had put in my left cargo pocket that morning was a notebook, spiral-bound, green cover, edges worn soft. From 11 years of handling, I carried it because I had learned that the work of your life can be stripped of your name, but it cannot be stripped of where it came from. I had not yet said a word. Before I tell you what happened, when the wrong man called the wrong sequence, and a camera no one thought to turn off kept running. Hit like and subscribe. Because what happened next, no one in that room, including me, had any way to prepare for. I grew up in San Antonio, in a house that smelled like antiseptic and refried beans, which is what happens when your mother is a home health aide, and your grandmother believes garlic cures most things. I was the kid in school who read the biology textbook before the teacher assigned it, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because the mechanics of how a body holds itself together struck me as the most extraordinary secret the world was keeping. That a person can take a piece of shrapnel to the femoral artery and have roughly 90 seconds before the math becomes irretrievable. That specific and terrible fact lodged in me at 17 and never left. I joined the Army in 2005 on a medical scholarship. I was 20 years old, and I thought I understood urgency. I did not yet understand urgency. They teach you protocols in school the way you teach a child to swim in a pool. Controlled, measured. The depth clearly marked. The field is not a pool. The field is whatever it is that day, and it does not care what you trained for. My first deployment put me in a forward surgical team in eastern Afghanistan, 23 years old, a first lieutenant in the medical corps. And the first thing I noticed was that our triage sequencing was built around an assumption that did not hold. The assumption was linear access, that you could reach casualties in the order they arrived. In a complex attack with multiple wound types across a wide area, you could not. You made decisions about who to reach first, based on incomplete information under direct fire. And the protocol we had gave you no framework for that decision. It gave you a checklist for after you had already made it. I started keeping notes, not official reports, just a notebook I carried in the left cargo pocket of my uniform. Next to a granola bar I was always meaning to eat. I wrote down what I saw, what decisions got made, by whom, based on what information, and what the outcomes were. I did it for 2 years. That first notebook was green, spiral-bound, by the time I filled it. The edges had gone soft from handling. and the cover had a watermark from a rain that had caught me without cover at a forward position. I have kept every notebook since. I have never thrown one away. By the time I was a captain, and the Army sent me to a residency program in trauma surgery, I had 3 notebooks and an argument. The argument was that the 90-second window in a complex mass casualty event was being systematically mismanaged. Not because the medics were bad, but because the decision framework they had was designed for a different kind of wound pattern. I wrote it up. I showed it to my supervising physician, a brilliant and impatient colonel named Yvette Marsh, who read it standing up in the hallway, outside the operating room, in the time it took 2 nurses to wheel a gurney past. She handed it back to me and said one thing: build the protocol, not just the argument. Colonel Marsh was 46 then, gray at the temples and constitutionally incapable of softening the truth, which made her the most useful person I have ever worked for. She had spent 20 years watching good ideas die, in the gap between the research and the field, and she had no patience for elegance that couldn't survive contact with a bad day. When I built the first version of the protocol, she tore it apart in 20 minutes and told me to build it again. I built it again. She tore it apart again. I built it a 3rd time, and she said, "Now go test it somewhere, it will be tested." She also told me something I carried for years, before I understood it. People will use your precision, Dana, and they will never understand it. And that is exactly why you must keep building it, because the day it is truly needed, the only person who can run it right is the person who built it from the inside. I heard that as a warning. I didn't hear it yet, as a prophecy. I spent the next 3 years refining the protocol, through 2 more deployments, and a joint training assignment in Kandahar in 2019 that would turn out to matter more than I knew. The Kandahar assignment was part of a coalition medical exchange program. US, British, French, and Australian military medical personnel working together for 8 weeks on trauma response integration. My counterpart on the British side was a lieutenant colonel named James Okafor, Royal Army Medical Corps, a tall, deliberate man from Lagos by way of Edinburgh, who had a gift for asking the question that made everything else irrelevant. He asked me, in our first session, why the protocol sequenced the way it did, not how. Why? I spent the next 3 hours explaining the logic from the inside, the way I had built it, the why beneath the what. He listened the way surgeons listen, with total stillness and a kind of hungry precision. At the end, he said, "I have never had a trauma protocol explained to me by the person who built it. That is the only way to actually learn one." We worked together for 8 weeks. By the end, he could run my protocol from memory, and he understood not just the steps, but the reasoning behind every branching decision. He told me before he left, "If I ever have a mass casualty situation, I want you on the radio." I laughed and said I hoped he never needed me. Before he left Kandahar, he told me his team had started calling me something. Not Major Reyes, not Doc. 90, for the window. The 90-second wall I had been talking about all 8 weeks. I told him I didn't need a call sign. He said it wasn't up to me. I let them believe what they wanted. I had learned by then that a name given by the people who actually understand the work is the only kind worth carrying. That was 2019. The story I'm about to tell you happened 3 years later, and James Okafor was not on a radio. He was 40 feet away, in the same room, but I need to get to Colonel Warren Steck first, because this story doesn't make sense without him. I met Steck in 2020. He was the incoming chief of the Joint Medical Planning Cell at a forward headquarters, and I had just been assigned to his team as a trauma protocols specialist, a title that sounded important and meant, in practice, that I sat in planning meetings and answered technical questions, while the men with more brass made the decisions. Steck was tall, well-pressed, and had the particular warmth of a man who has spent his career understanding that likability is a tool. He was good at his job, in the ways that are visible. He was not good at his job, in the ways that are not. He did not recognize me as a peer. He recognized me as a resource. There is a specific kind of man who makes that distinction, without realizing it is a distinction at all, who sees a woman answering technical questions in the back of a briefing room and processes her as infrastructure, rather than author. Steck was that kind of man. He was not cruel about it. He was thorough. In his mental architecture, the work produced under his command was his team's work, and his team's work was his work to present. And that was simply how the chain operated. And it had never once occurred to him to question whether that architecture had a blind spot, the size of a person. I had been in the planning cell with him for 8 months before I understood that this was the shape of the thing. In that time, I watched him do what he was genuinely good at, which was making a room feel like everything was under control. He had a way of standing at the front of a brief that made junior officers sit up straighter, not because he said anything that required it, but because he occupied space the way a man who has never once doubted his own authority occupies space, completely, and without apology. What I noticed, and kept to myself, was that the questions he could not answer were always the ones that began with why, how the protocol worked, smooth, confident, one hand moving across the reference sheet. Why a specific sequencing decision was structured the way it was. A pause, a redirect, a pivot to something adjacent that sounded relevant and was not. Why is the most important word in any framework? It is the difference between a person who can run a protocol on a good day and a person who can hold it together on the worst one. He had never once asked me why, and I think this is the part that took me years to see clearly. He never asked because it did not occur to him that there was a why to ask me about. The work was his team's work. I was on the team. The category was complete. And the category had no room in it for the possibility that I was the one who had built the logic. He was presenting as his own instinct. I kept attending the briefs. I kept sitting against the wall. I kept answering the how questions when he needed them and absorbing the silence around the why ones. I learned a long time ago that the words you do not spend are the only ones you never have to take back. And there was nothing to say that would have changed a man's assumptions about who I was without first changing the assumptions themselves. And that was not a thing I could do from a chair against the wall. I submitted the protocol for formal review in October of 2020. I had been developing it for 6 years at that point. It was 47 pages of evidence-based trauma sequencing, built on data from 11 deployments across 4 countries, with outcome tracking that showed a statistically significant improvement in 90-second survival rates in complex mass casualty events. It was the best work I had ever done. It was probably the best work I will ever do. I submitted it through Steck's office, because he was my direct superior and that was the chain. In February of 2021, a version of it appeared in a Pentagon medical planning brief. The author listed was Colonel Warren Steck. My name appeared in the acknowledgments section, in the same font size as the citations. I found out later, not then, but later, through a file that surfaced during the attribution review, that the routing decision had not been Steck's alone. Above him, a brigadier general named Marcus Webb had seen the original submission cross his desk. Webb was the Deputy Surgeon General's liaison to the Joint Planning Command, a careful political navigator who had spent 20 years understanding which names opened doors in Pentagon briefing rooms and which names did not. He had looked at my 47 pages and made a calculation. A female protocol specialist, 1 rank below colonel, did not open those doors. A combat-experienced male colonel with the right relationships did. So he had called Steck's office and told them to prepare a brief. He had never mentioned my name to anyone at that level. Not once. That is the shape of the thing. When you finally see it whole. Steck was the face of it. Webb was the architecture. And neither of them had ever needed to say anything explicitly wrong. because the system already knew how to carry the implication. My deputy at the time was a sharp, relentless captain named Lena Park, who had the useful habit of reading every document that crossed our section, regardless of whether it was addressed to her. She dropped the brief on my desk on a Tuesday morning and sat down across from me without saying anything, and waited. I read it again. I turned to the acknowledgments page. I read that. Then I closed it and set it down. I put my hand flat on the cover for a moment. The way you steady yourself against something solid when the ground has moved under you. Then I took it off. The notebook was in my cargo pocket. I did not take it out. I just knew it was there. "They put you in the footnotes, ma'am," Lena said. "The whole thing is built on your 6 years, and they put you in the footnotes." "I know," I said. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to keep building it," I said. "Because the protocol isn't finished, and because the only thing I could do right now that would make things worse is spend the next 6 months in a grievance process instead of the work." She looked at me for a long moment, with the particular expression of someone who thinks you are being either very wise or very stupid, and cannot yet tell which. "The appendix," she said, in the same tone you'd say. "The grave." "The appendix," I agreed. "You already know how the second wave ended. I showed you that in the first minutes of this story." Steck's hand moving toward me in front of Claremont, the brief with the wrong cover, the voice in the corridor. What the opening did not show was the 30 seconds before the hand moved. Steck had been presenting well. He had the brief, and he had the room. And he had the settled confidence of a man who believes the work produced under his command is simply his work to present. Claremont asked why, not how. Why the branching logic was structured that specific way, and not the conventional linear approach. And I watched Steck's answer begin to drift the way it always drifted, when the why came up, that familiar redirect toward something adjacent, except the room was too senior for a drift. And so, he turned toward the back. You know the rest. The hand, the gesture toward the equipment. I went home that evening, and I opened the notebook for the first time in 6 months. I wrote down one sentence. A name given by the people who actually understand the work is the only kind worth carrying. Then I closed it, and I went back to building the protocol, because that was still the one thing I could do, that they could not route through someone else's office. I want you to understand what the next 2 years cost me to carry quietly, because what happened in that room later only makes sense if you know the weight I had been holding. Lena kept a running document she called the real acknowledgments page, which was her way of preserving her own sanity, and mine. It was not a document I ever intended to use. It turned out I didn't need to. The day I'm going to tell you about was supposed to be an exercise. That is the first thing you need to know. A multinational mass casualty response exercise. US, British, French, Australian forces, plus a rotating delegation of medical observers from 3 partner nations, set at a joint forward operating base in a classified location. I'll call the Eastern Compound. 21 medical personnel, 4 surgical teams, a purpose-built scenario with simulated casualties, and a room of observers taking notes for an after-action report that would go to the Surgeons General of 4 countries. Steck had been designated Joint Medical Response Lead. His name was on the orders, and on the scenario brief. And on the laminated command card at the head of the table, I had been assigned as Medical Support Coordinator, which meant I managed personnel, logistics, equipment, inventory, and the translation layer between clinical decisions and administrative process. The British coalition's designated senior medical officer for the exercise was Lieutenant Colonel James Okafor. That role carried a specific authority the exercise protocols had built in deliberately. The right to call a halt to any clinical procedure that violated coalition medical standards, independent of the U.S. chain of command. Joint exercises had learned the hard way what happens when national rank outweighs clinical judgment. The provision existed, so that no single nation's command structure could override a partner's medical officer on a question of patient safety. Okafor was the only person in that room whose stop-work authority did not run through Steck. I was. In the language of that room, the help, I had been in worse positions. My left knee announced bad weather the morning of the exercise, a habit it picked up in the second Kandahar rotation, when I spent 3 hours in a crouch behind a concrete barrier during a mortar response, and has not broken since. That morning it was announcing something other than weather. I took a chair at the coordination table against the back wall, the one without the laminated command card. I put the notebook on the table in front of me, closed, and I opened my laptop, and I waited. I had learned long ago that waiting is a skill, and that the people who can wait without grinding their teeth are almost always the people who understand the room better than the people standing at the front of it. The exercise was supposed to begin at 0800. At 0712, it stopped being an exercise. A coordinated IED strike on a vehicle column 4 kilometers from the compound sent 23 casualties inbound across 3 casualty collection vehicles. The nature of the wounds: multiple blast patterns, combined blunt and penetrating trauma, 3 airways compromised, 2 tourniquets already applied, and a third needed. 1 suspected tension pneumothorax, 14 walking wounded with shrapnel distributions that hadn't been assessed yet. Was almost exactly the scenario type the protocol had been built for. Not exactly, but close enough, that someone who understood it from the inside would have known what to do. The observer delegation was still in the room. The cameras were still running, because no one had thought quickly enough to turn them off. The exercise had become real while they were all still in exercise mode, and the lag between those two things cost about 40 seconds that we could not afford. Steck took the floor. He had the command card and the laminated protocol reference sheet that had been prepared from his own brief, from my work, formatted with his name at the header. And he began calling the sequencing. I need you to understand what happened next, because it is the only reason any of the rest of this story exists. The protocol sequences the triage assessment by wound mechanism first, then by physiological priority, then by surgical urgency, in a specific order that matters, because it prevents 2 teams from working at cross purposes. On casualties whose needs conflict, the sequencing is counterintuitive at first. It asks you to pass over the loudest patient to reach the one who looks quieter, because the loud patient is usually managing, and the quiet one is usually failing. Every medic I have ever trained has pushed back on that the first time. Every medic I have ever trained has understood it by the second time. The reason is in the math. You cannot understand it from the outside. You have to have built it to know why it is right. What happened next was quiet, in the way that only the worst kind of wrong can be quiet. Okafor's team had stopped. Our team too had stopped. The casualties were still moving toward us, and Steck stood at the board with the reference sheet. My reference sheet, formatted with his name at the header, and he looked at it the way a person looks at a map of a city they have never walked through. The route was there. The streets were named, but he did not know which way north was. He called a secondary triage step that the protocol explicitly delays until after mechanism assessment. It is the most counterintuitive decision in the entire framework. The one I have explained hundreds of times. The one every medic fights me on first, and understands by the second time. You can only know why it is right if someone who built it explained it to you from the inside. No one had ever explained it to him from the inside. He had read the summary. He had presented the summary to generals. He had answered every how question with confidence, and redirected every why question to something that sounded adjacent. He had never once sat in a borrowed room at 2 a.m. with the data from 11 deployments, and asked himself why the branching decision worked the way it did, because the branching decision had not cost him anything yet. It was about to cost him everything. The reference sheet could not save him. It was a map of a city he had never visited, and in the time it took him to realize the turn was wrong, Okafor had already stopped his team, and was looking across the floor. James Okafor, the British coalition's senior medical officer, the one person in that room whose authority to call a halt existed independent of the U.S. chain of command, stopped. It was not a dramatic stop. It was a still, considered stop. The kind that comes over a person when they recognize something they have been trained to recognize, the way a surgeon recognizes a presentation they have seen before, and knows exactly what it means. He held his team in place, with one raised hand. "Colonel," he said, "the sequencing you've called does not match the Reyes framework." Steck's response was the response of a man who has been challenged in public. Quick, assured, slightly too assured. "Protocol's right here." "Son," he said, holding up the reference sheet. "I'm calling it by the book." Okafor looked at the reference sheet. He looked at it the way I recognized, the way you look at a document when you know the source material, and you are checking how much has survived the translation. Then he looked back at Steck, and when he spoke again, his voice had the specific quality of a person who has decided to be very precise. "Sir," he said, "I need to be clear about what I am telling you, because we have 23 casualties inbound, and I do not have time to be unclear. I trained in this protocol for 8 weeks in Kandahar in 2019. Under Major Reyes herself. Not from a brief, not from a reference sheet, from the person who built it, decision by decision, and I have the session notes and the outcome logs to confirm every hour of it. I have run this protocol twice in live mass casualty situations since then. Both times it held. I know why the mechanism first sequencing is ordered the way it is. I know what it costs to get wrong. I know the difference between the version that was summarized and the version that was built. Because I was taught by the person who built it, and I am looking at the version that was summarized. And I am telling you that the version that was built is better. And the person who built it is in this room." He did not raise his voice. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes on Steck. "Sir, where is Major Reyes?" Every head in that room turned, including Steck's, somewhere above us. An air handling unit cycled on. In the silence that followed Okafor's question, it was the loudest thing in the building. I was sitting in the back corner, with my laptop and a coordinator's badge, and a chair that had not been designed for this conversation. The notebook was closed in front of me on the table. I had not yet said a word. I had sat against walls in worse rooms. I set both hands flat on the notebook and kept them there. Lena Park was 4 chairs down. She went very still and found my eyes across the distance, and the look on her face said, "Now. This is the moment. You take it." I held her eyes for a second, and I let the moment be what it was. Then Brigadier General Patricia Holt, who commanded the Joint Medical Command and had been sitting in the observer section with a yellow legal pad and reading glasses on a lanyard, set down her pen. She was a compact woman of about 55, with a history in trauma surgery, and the particular stillness of someone who has operated in the field and knows what calm looks like when things are going wrong around it. She had been watching the floor and taking notes, and when Okafor said the name, she wrote something on the legal pad and underlined it twice. "Stand by," she said, in a voice that made the room comply. She looked at Steck. "Colonel, give me 60 seconds." She crossed the room to me. She did not sit down. She stood in front of my chair and looked at me with the directness of a person who has spent 55 years not having time to waste. "You are Dana Reyes," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the badge on my jacket. Medical Support Coordination. She looked back at my face. "How long have you been building this protocol?" "I started keeping field notes in 2007, ma'am. The formal framework took shape in 2013. The version currently in use took me until 2020 to get right." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said, "Colonel Okafor. Is that his name?" "Yes, ma'am. British Ramsey. He knows your work. He trained under me for 8 weeks in 2019. He understands the architecture." She nodded once, the way a surgeon nods when the diagnosis confirms what they already suspected. Her eyes went briefly to the notebook on the table in front of me. Green cover, worn edges, and then back to my face. "I think I understand the file now," she said quietly. "Give me 30 seconds." She turned back to the room. Her voice was level, and carried the weight of someone who does not speak unless they have decided to. She said, Stand down the current sequencing. We are calling a 30-second reset. Then she said my name, my rank, and my role with a clarity that felt, after 11 years, like a window being opened in a room that had been sealed for too long. Major Reyes, she said, I would like you to take the medical lead. Steck was on his feet. He had the look of a man who has decided the problem must be administrative, because if it is administrative, it can be solved by rank and protocol and procedure. And he has more of those than anyone in the room. General, he said, with respect. Ma'am, I am the designated lead for this response. That is in the orders. I appreciate the coordination concern, but we have casualties inbound, and this is not the moment to... The protocol we are using to respond to those casualties, General Holt said, stopping him simply by continuing to speak, was not built by you. I know that because I spent the last 4 minutes reading the version history in the planning file on my tablet, and the primary author on every draft prior to February 2021 is the officer currently sitting at the support coordination table. She paused, one breath. The detail I would like your attention on, Colonel, is that Lieutenant Colonel Okafor has identified a sequencing error in the version you've called, and he has offered to work from the original. That is not a coordination concern. That is arithmetic. Step back from the board. He did not step back immediately. Men who are used to being in the center of rooms almost never step back immediately. He held his position for a moment with the expression of someone doing the calculation, the one where you weigh what you lose, against what it will cost to keep fighting for it, and the math of the room was working against him, in a way that no rank or laminated reference sheet was going to resolve. He stepped back. I crossed the floor. I picked up the notebook from the table as I stood, not to use it, just to carry it. The way you carry the thing that grounds you, when the room is about to ask everything of you. Lena Park, 2 chairs behind me, made a sound she was trying to suppress, and I loved her for trying. I took the position at the head of the response floor, not the head of the table, because this was not a table. This was a floor with 23 inbound casualties, and a team that needed a decision framework, and not a hierarchy lesson. And I looked at Okafor across the space. He met my eyes, and gave me one short nod, the kind that carries 2 years and 8 weeks. And a morning in Kandahar when we had both said, out loud to each other, that we hoped the world would never make us need this. The world had made us need this. Begin at mechanism assessment, I said. Team 2 with me. Teams 3 and 4 hold position for secondary triage output. Trust the framework. What followed was not a victory. I want to be plain about that. What followed was 38 minutes of the most concentrated work I have done in my professional life, and it was not clean, and it was not elegant. And 2 of those 23 people were closer to the line than I ever want to be responsible for again. But the protocol held. It held because I knew it from the inside, because Okafor knew it from 8 weeks of learning it from the source, because the teams ran the decision branches, the way they were built to be run, and because the thing I had spent 11 years building was, in the moment it was actually needed, exactly as good as I had made it. The tension pneumothorax case came in 6th in the arrival sequence. Standard linear triage would have put him 14th. The protocol's mechanism-first sequencing surfaced him at position 3. The time difference between those 2 positions, in that casualty, was the difference between a saved airway and a conversation no one wanted to have with his family. I will not tell you that every decision I made that day was right, because medicine does not work that way. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not stood in front of a bad day. But I will tell you that the decisions that mattered were right. And they were right because I had built the framework by being wrong, carefully and repeatedly, until I understood exactly where the edges were. When the last of the 23 was stabilized, and the immediate response phase was over. The room changed character the way a room does after something very large and very fast has moved through it. People who had been in pure execution mode came back into their own bodies and started looking around at what they had just been part of. The observer delegation, which had been pressed against the walls for 38 minutes, was very quiet. Their legal pads had a great deal of writing on them. General Holt found me first. She was still holding the yellow legal pad, and her pen was uncapped. "Your documentation on the mechanism first sequencing," she said. "How complete is it?" "Complete, ma'am. Full outcome data from 11 deployments, 4 partner nations. Over a period of 6 years. The mathematical case for the branching decisions is in the appendices of the 2020 submission, the appendices that weren't included. In the February 2021 brief, she heard what I was not saying. I watched her hear it. "I have been doing this for 28 years. Colonel," she said it before I could correct her, before I could say that I was a major, and I understood that she was saying it on purpose. "I have rarely read a medical planning file as thorough or as carefully constructed as the one I just pulled on my tablet. I would like to know why the author of that file is sitting at the support coordination table, because that is where I was assigned." "Ma'am," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. It was not an unkind look. It was the look of a person deciding to stop accepting a lie, because it is convenient. "I have 31 years of files in my experience," she said, "and most of them are written by people who want their names visible in them. Yours reads like someone trying to disappear into the work." "Yes, ma'am, that is the only kind of work that ever actually holds," she said, "which is why I am not going to allow it to be wasted." She looked across the floor to where Steck was standing, alone, watching a room reorganize itself around a truth, that his name on a cover page had not changed. And then she looked back at me. "Give me the complete documentation, every appendix, the full outcome data. I want to read it tonight," I said. "Yes, ma'am," and sent it to her tablet in the time it took her to walk back across the floor. Steck came to me in the corridor during the documentation debrief. He moved the way people move when they are doing something they have not practiced and cannot make comfortable. A little too direct, a little too close, looking at a point slightly past my face, rather than into my eyes. "I want to tell you something," he said. His voice was low, because there were still people nearby, and he had enough situational awareness to understand that the corridor was not the right stage for whatever this was. I held my expression level. I had learned long ago that calm is the one thing that bluster cannot get any grip on, and that the best time to be completely calm is the moment someone needs you to be emotional, so they can feel that the situation is under control, he said. "I know the brief. I know how it was submitted. I want you to know that I understood what I was working with. I understood it was extraordinary work. That is why I made sure it reached the right audience." "That is one way to describe it," I said. He looked at me. I think most people had not spoken to him that way in a long time, not because I was hard or cutting, because I was simply clear. And clear has a way of landing that loud never does. "I would like to make it right," he said. "If there's a way." I thought about Yvette Marsh telling me to build the protocol and not just the argument. I thought about 11 years of notebooks and bad days, and 23 casualties on a floor, where the outcome was the only thing that mattered, and not the name on the cover page. I thought about Lena Park keeping the document she called the real acknowledgements page, and the weight of every entry in it. And then I set all of that down, not because I forgave it, because I had stood in a room 38 minutes ago and done the job. And the job had held. And 23 people were going to sleep in functioning bodies tonight. And at some point, the weight of what I had been wronged becomes a thing you carry, instead of a thing that carries you. "There is a way," I said. "It involves reading, all of it, not the summary. Every appendix, the outcome data, the branching decision logic, the field notes going back to 2007. If you want to make it right, you start by actually understanding what you put your name on. Because on the day it matters and you have to run it, you need to know it from the inside. You cannot know it from a cover page." He held my eyes for longer than was comfortable, and then he nodded once. Slowly, in a way that meant something, though I could not yet tell exactly what. "I'm willing to do that reading," he said. Then start tonight, I said. The files are complete. General Holt has them. I'll make sure you do too. Paul Renner, the senior civilian medical liaison, a careful 60-year-old man in a gray blazer who had been in the observer delegation since the beginning, found me next. He had a quiet voice, and the habit of making everything he said sound like the last and most important thing he would say on any given subject. I need to tell you something that I should have told you sooner, he said. I've been in and out of the medical planning world for 20 years. I have read a lot of protocol development files. The work you produced is not the kind of thing that comes out of a career easily. It is the kind of thing that comes out of a life. He paused. The monitoring recommendation that's going forward, the protocol attribution review, the development credit documentation. I want you to know it is going forward with my name on it in support. The full recommendation. Not the version that protects everyone's feelings. The accurate one. I took that in. It landed somewhere specific. In the place where the thing you stopped expecting to get feels, when it finally arrives, less like triumph and more like an old debt being quietly settled. Thank you, sir, I said. I mean it. He nodded and then he said, I owe you an apology for an earlier conversation. 6 months ago, you submitted a request through channels for a protocol review and attribution audit. I received it. I tabled it because the timing was inconvenient for a procurement cycle I was managing. I did not follow up. I want to acknowledge that directly, and on the record if you want it there. I thought about this for a moment. I could have ended several careers in that corridor with the right few sentences. The temptation had a specific weight to it. It had years of weight behind it, I said. It's on the record when it needs to be, sir. What I need right now is for the protocol to go forward correctly attributed, so that the next person who has to run it gets the full version with the full logic, and not just the summary. That's what matters. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he said, yes. And I believed him. James Okafor found me last. After the debrief had closed and the room had started to empty, he was still in his gear, which made him look exactly as he had looked in Kandahar 3 years earlier. And he had the expression of a man who has done a thing that cost him something, and has not yet decided if it was the right thing. I may have made your life complicated, he said. You saved 2 people's airways, I said. I also made a rather large point of it in front of observers from 4 nations, and a camera that was still running. Yes, I said. You did. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in 2019 you told me that a protocol only holds as long as the people running it understand why it works. Not just how. Why? I remember. I said. I have run it twice since then, he said. Both times it held. Both times I knew it held because you explained it to me from the inside. He looked across the empty floor. I was not going to let someone run it from the outside today. Not in that room. Not with those casualties. I understand, I said. He held out his hand. I shook it. He said, the protocol needs your name on it, not for politics, because the next person I train in it, the next James Okafor who needs to understand why the branching decisions work. They need to be able to trace it back to the person who built the reasoning. They need to know who to call. When they have a question, the reference sheet doesn't answer. There are a lot of things that were said to me that day that I will carry. That one, I will carry the farthest. The attribution review completed in 4 months. My name went onto the protocol as primary developer, not in the acknowledgement section, not in the appendix. Primary developer. Steck's name remained as co-author on the 2021 submission, which he had earned in the narrow sense that his office had produced that submission. I did not seek to remove that. I sought the accurate record. The 2021 Pentagon brief. The one that had carried his name to the Joint Medical Response Program. The one that had earned him the command card at the Eastern Compound. The one that General Claremont had nodded at while looking at Steck instead of me, was formally retracted and reissued in March of 2022. All 47 pages. Every archive copy. Every distribution in the 14 partner commands that had received it. Primary developer, Major Dana Reyes. The brief had directly supported 2 subsequent assignment approvals listed under Steck's name. Both were audited when the retraction was filed. One was rescinded in full. The other was reduced in scope. The personnel figure that followed him from one command to the next was now 31% of what he had started with. The protocol he had used as a ladder was now, on the record, in every place the record existed, someone else's ladder. He had climbed exactly as far as it could take him. Then, it had carried me past him. I am not telling you this as a victory. I am telling you this as the arithmetic of a thing built correctly, finally settling into its true weight, the same weight it always had, now simply distributed the right way. General Marcus Webb retired 6 weeks after the review closed, 18 months earlier than his projected date. The announcement used the word voluntary. The file that triggered the review had included his routing memo, the one where he had explicitly reassigned authorship before the brief went up. Renner told me afterward that Webb had read the attribution findings and had not contested a single line. He had simply asked how much time he had. They had told him 6 weeks. He had taken exactly that. I did not feel triumph about that either. What I felt was something more like the specific relief of a weight you did not know you were carrying until the moment it was finally set down somewhere other than on you. Lena Park made captain that year, which mattered to me more than the order that came down the following month recommending me for advancement to lieutenant colonel. She had spent 3 years saying the true thing in rooms where the true thing was inconvenient. And that is the habit that gets people buried in the appendix, far more often than it gets them promoted. And when her results came through, she called me before she called anyone else. Somebody finally read the support section, she said. They saw my name down there in small print. You always had the only credit that matters, I told her. You knew exactly what you were looking at. Steck sent me a message 8 weeks after the review closed. He had done the reading. All of it. The 2007 field notes, the branching logic appendix, the outcome data tables I had spent 6 years building. He wrote about specific sections, with the specificity of someone who had genuinely gone in, not to manage the situation, but to understand it. He wrote, I know what I did with the submission. I have known since the room. I am not going to ask you to call it something it wasn't, but I want you to know that I have read the full file and I understand now what you built and why you built it that way. And I am going to spend the remainder of my career making sure the people who train on it understand the same thing. It was not an apology that erased anything. It was a man who had finally started reading the actual material, instead of the summary. I let that be what it was, and I let it be enough. 6 months after the attribution review closed, I received a message through the Coalition Medical Network. It came from a training facility in a partner nation, one of the countries whose observers had been in the room that day. A medical instructor there had just run the protocol for the first time in a live mass casualty drill. She wanted me to know that her team had asked, during the debrief, why the mechanism first sequencing worked the way it did. She had been able to answer them, not because she had read the reference sheet, because someone who had trained under Okafor, who had trained under me, had explained it to her from the inside. I read that message twice. Then I wrote back 1 sentence. That is the whole point of building it that way. She wrote back 3 words. We know now. And then, a week later, a longer message. We're teaching that too. We're teaching who built it and why. The instructors here want the full file, not the 2021 version, the original, with the field notes. I set the phone down, and for the first time in a long while, I did not need to carry anything quietly. I put my hand in my left cargo pocket and I felt the notebook there, edges worn soft. And I understood something I had been circling for 11 years, without quite landing on. The work does not need you to protect it. You only need to build it correctly, and then teach one person from the inside, and they will teach the next person. And the protocol will travel farther than your name ever could, and it will arrive in rooms you will never see, and it will hold. That is the whole design, not the 47 pages, the transmission. The why passed hand to hand, until it reaches the person who needs it on the worst day of their life, and does not have time to wonder whether the framework makes sense. It makes sense. I built it to make sense. And now other people know why. I still think about 90 seconds. Not in the abstract anymore. I think about it in terms of specific people. The young man whose airway we reached at position 3 instead of 14th. The 2 casualties whose outcomes swung on a branching decision that only makes sense if you know why it was built that way. I think about a medical instructor in a partner nation, explaining to her team in her language the why beneath the what, and her team leaning in, because for the first time the framework was being explained to them from the inside. 90 seconds is still the wall. I am still building against it. The only thing that has changed is that now, when the moment comes, the people running the framework know who built it and why it works. I still carry the notebook. The edges are softer now. The protocol that runs in 6 countries does not need it anymore. It has moved beyond my handwriting into other people's hands and other people's training rooms. But I carry it anyway, because some things are not meant to be let go of. They are meant to be carried forward. Passed to the next person who asks the right question. James Okafor asked me why. That is the whole story. If you want to compress it down to one sentence, he was the first person in 8 months who asked me why, and I told him. And 3 years later, that why was the thing that held, when the how could not. That is enough. I have decided that has to be enough. And on most days, it truly is. So, if you have made it all the way here with me, wherever you are, whatever room you are sitting in, whatever chair against whatever wall, I want to say something directly to you. You might be the person in your unit, or your hospital, or your company, who does the real work in the back of the room. You might be the one whose name goes in the acknowledgments, while someone else takes the cover page. You might have spent years being seen as what you do, instead of who you are. I know that place. I lived in it for 11 years. Here is what I learned there. A thing that is built correctly does not forget who built it. You can put any name you like on the cover page, but the day it is truly needed, the day the pressure spikes and the hands go looking for what they actually know, the cover page is not what saves anyone. The logic is, the framework is, the 11 years of field notes and bad days, and rebuilt versions. And the voice of a person who explained it from the inside. You cannot take that from the person who built it. You can delay the moment it becomes visible. You cannot make that moment not come. Do your work. Build it correctly. Teach it to the people who want to learn it from the source. Trust that somewhere there is a James Okafor who trained under you in a borrowed room and remembers exactly what you told him and why. And who will, on the day that it matters. Stop everything in a room full of cameras and say, "Where is the person who actually built this?" And when he says it, you will not need to raise your voice. You will not need to say a word. You will already have said all of them. In the rooms that mattered, to the people who were actually listening. 90 seconds. That is still the number. That is still the wall. And on the day someone runs the framework correctly in a room I will never see, because they were taught by someone who was taught by someone I sat with in Kandahar and explained it to from the inside. That wall will hold. That is what the work is for. Not the table. Not the cameras. Not the name on the cover page. They named the protocol after him. But the 90 seconds belong to whoever can answer why it works. That person was never him. It was always going to be whoever built it in the dark, in the borrowed rooms, across 11 years, because the work demanded it, not because anyone was watching. If this story meant something to you, if you know someone sitting in the back of a room right now doing the real work, while someone else holds the laminated card, share it with them. They may need to hear that the day comes. If you've ever watched someone take your work and wear it as their own, and then watch the truth surface anyway, in its own time, in its own way, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Did you speak up in the moment, or hold your peace? Would you have done what Okafor did? Tell me. I read every single one.